Recently returned from Africa. How significant is the loss of Awlaki to that particular region of the world's expression of al-Qaeda?
Well, if you listen to U.S. officials over the past 2 years, they've really been focusing on Somalia and its neighbor just across the water, Yemen, as the two primary sources of a threat coming from al-Qaeda-affiliated organizations, the Shabab in Somalia and AQAP in Yemen, of which Anwar Awlaki, and we have to be clear about this, was barely even mid-level management, despite the proclamations by senior U.S. officials, media outlets, including this one earlier today, saying he was the leader of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Anwar Awlaki was largely influential in U.S. counterterrorism circles. The U.S. government was watching him. He spoke fluent English, had the ability to reach out to English-speaking Muslims. He was a virtual nobody, though, in Yemen or elsewhere in the al-Qaeda world. He really was not a known entity. Laura Kasanoff of the New York Times is in Sana'a today. She said the vast majority of people she talked to on the streets of Yemen had no idea that he was killed or that there was an Anwar Awlaki. It's news to them.
Robin, you quote from a West Point counterterrorism report in your book suggesting that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was not attracting vast numbers in terms of support. But wasn't Awlaki's mission much more to use the internet to raise up lone terrorists across Europe and North Africa?
Yes, Awlaki really was important because he represented the tech-savvy second generation of al-Qaeda. And he had been able to mobilize people not by reaching out through sermons, but by using the internet, and was quite effective in doing so, and reaching, frankly, for the first time into the United States and mobilizing, whether it's Somalis in Minnesota, you know, a range of people who were willing to kind of go beyond the kind of profiles the United States had been dealing with in the aftermath of 9/11.
But of course, Robin, he was also effective, was he not, in inspiring the shooter in the Fort Hood massacre?
Absolutely. As I said, reaching out to Muslims in the United States. And so he played a role in a way when you had both bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, his replacement, isolated in somewhere along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. He was much more effective in kind of keeping al-Qaeda alive, in some ways far more effectively, more visibly, and more operationally than bin Laden was.
Jeremy, do you think the cache of DVDs of computers that were taken from bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, do you think that they have directly led to the successful mission involving Awlaki?
I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that the early reports coming out of Yemen is that there was some sort of intelligence obtained from another AQAP operative that was captured at some point in Yemen. I think if you ask the vast majority of Yemens a question, who do you think is a bigger threat to the world or to stability, Anwar Awlaki or their own U.S.-backed president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, they would say Saleh. I have to take issue, though, with something that Robin said. If you look at the connection between Awlaki and Nidal Hassan, the alleged Fort Hood shooter, who has not been prosecuted yet, those emails do not give any indication that Awlaki played an operational role in it. He praised it after the fact, but what investigators have said that have reviewed those is that they were having a religious discussion. It may have been a radical religious discussion, but to leap from that to Awlaki being operational, as so many pundits are doing, I think is irresponsible. We have the president playing judge, jury, and executioner against an American citizen. That, to me, should be the premier issue we're discussing today in the United States.
Robin, some commentators are suggesting that President Obama has had more foreign policy successes under his watch than any other president in the last 20 years. And yet this morning, we're hearing former ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, attempting to play down the president's success. Now, you're an objective expert in the field of foreign affairs. Tell me, do you agree that the Obama administration has been effective in this area?
Well, I think when you look at what the Obama administration has done, either in the so-called war on terrorism or dealing with extremism, also at the same time being more realistic in terms of the pro-democracy movement that's broken out across the Middle East, that there are more tangible successes, there's more realism, and that you know, I think history will look back and say Obama was far more effective than President Bush was on either front.
Jeremy, Afghanistan and Pakistan remain the areas with the largest number of potential terrorists, training grounds, recruitment areas, often in areas where the government of Pakistan doesn't operate. And then we heard Admiral Mullen saying that the Pakistan security agencies have been colluding with terrorists. Do you think this idea of basically taking a drone and flying into someone else's territory, invading the compound of bin Laden in Pakistan without informing the authorities. Do you think this is the way that American agencies are now going to operate?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, the Obama doctrine, as it's emerging, is very similar to the early stages of the Bush doctrine, which is that the entire world is a battlefield. You could argue, though, President Obama has dramatically expanded this targeted killing operation, is doing it in a more surgical way, is trying to get away from large-scale occupations, and saying to allies and enemy countries alike, we will go in when we determine it's in U.S. interest to do so. I have great concerns about that as a strategy, but John Bolton is full of hot air almost always. But on this particular point, President Obama is taking the Bush agenda much further than McCain ever would have, because he's normalizing these policies to a large base of Democratic supporters. That to me is what's remarkable. How many people now have support for very aggressive policies that they would have been criticizing if it was a Republican implementing them?
Can you imagine Bolton or someone like that referring to what's happened yesterday with Awlaki in the negative terms that he did if there was a Republican president?
No, he would be you know, out in front of the White House chanting USA, USA, you know, and you know, he'd act like he was at the World Cup or something.
Robin, you spent time yourself in Yemen, and I've read your book, as I've said, in detail. It's a fascinating account of democratic movements that are swelling and changing. Jeremy was saying earlier that he thinks most people in Yemen would actually have more hate for their president than they would for Awlaki. What's your sense now about the way Yemenis are going to respond to what's happened within their country, these drone attacks?
Yemenis are, first of all, absolutely more preoccupied with what's going on in terms of the internal political dynamics, the political struggle for the future of this nation. To them, al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula is a minor player, except in certain parts of the country. I'm not sure that anyone cares about Anwar al-Awlaki or knows much about him. The drone issues, like in Pakistan, are a major issue, a politicizing issue. But with one thing I'll disagree with Jeremy, and that is the American footprint on the ground has alienated so many Muslims in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, particularly in terms of what U.S. motives are perceived to be, that the idea of drone strikes versus you know, hundreds of thousands of troops or tens of thousands of troops on the ground, I think, you know, is one that you can't argue. Most Arabs, most Muslims would like to see American troops withdrawn. At the same time, they don't like the idea of them paying the price for extremism as well, that far more Iraqis, far more Afghans have been killed by suicide bombers than Americans have in either country. And many of the people resident in those countries would like to see al-Qaeda and its affiliates eliminated, whatever it takes.
I actually don't think I disagree with what Robin said there. But one, you know, maybe minor nuance to this is that if you look at the history of U.S. drone strikes or Tomahawk cruise missile strikes in Yemen and in Somalia, while they do occasionally hit someone that they were intended to hit, like an Awlaki or Saleh al-Nabhan in Somalia, they also do kill a tremendous number of innocent people in so-called collateral damage. With the tribal politics in Yemen, that can have a devastating impact. December 2009, the U.S. blew up a bunch of important tribal people. That has ramifications. So it's the calculus. When you're trying to kill one so-called bad guy and you end up killing 30 innocent people, you're creating 30 new enemies and all of their tribal members, families, generations to come. It's blowback is what we're seeing.
A very delicate process and a very difficult war. Robin Wright and Jeremy Scahill, thank you for joining us this afternoon.